Welcome to the Big Money Questions show. I'm Rachel Rickard-Strauss, Personal Finance Editor for This Is Money. This week, giving to charity. How do we do it? How do we make sure our money is doing good and having the greatest impact? We've got Caroline Fiennes. She's going to tell us how to do it. She's written a book on the subject. It ain't what you give, it's the way that you give it. And she's also the director of Giving Evidence, which is a company that specialises in advice on giving based on evidence. Caroline, thank you so much for taking on this challenge.
You're welcome. Nice to talk with you.
Can we start from the beginning? How do we give to charity to make sure that we're having an impact?
Well, the key thing to remember about giving is that it's a mechanism for turning money into some kind of social change or environmental change. That's what we're trying to do. And giving that money to a charity is one way that we can do it. But there are other ways that we could use that money. We could give it to social enterprises, we could give it to individuals directly, we could get involved as activists ourselves. There's lots of different things we could do. One of the most important things to understand about any kind of social change or any kind of intervention is to figure out what happens as a result of this intervention that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So, for example, I'll give you an example. There's a program in South Africa, a remedial education program, runs in KwaZulu-Natal. And it's like loads of programs, a bit like that. And if you simply look at the difference in how well kids can read before and after the program, it turns out that they improve quite a lot during the 12 weeks of the program. And if I just told you that, you'd think, oh, that looks like a great program, I'll give it some money. But if I then compare the change in the reading levels of the kids that do the program with the change in reading levels over the same period of very similar kids who don't get the program, it turns out it's exactly the same.
Okay.
So what we're seeing there is that actually the program itself kind of looks like it's achieving something. When you dig a bit deeper, it's not achieving anything. Actually, that effect is simply due to the passage of time and the fact that kids learn things whether you teach them or not. And this concept of trying to understand the effectiveness of a charity by looking at what would have happened otherwise is absolutely central.
Okay, so that's peeling off quite a few layers, because I think perhaps instinctively when we're trying to decide how to give, we might look at what the problems are and try to work out what ones we're most concerned about or what seem to be the greatest problems and focus that way. Or we might look at what the most interesting projects are that charities are doing. But you're saying that it's even further than that. It's what difference are those projects making?
Yes, and the aim of the game is to find some charity that can turn your money into some social change, right, that you care about, some improvement in the world that you care about. 95%, I would say, of adverts and communications that one sees from charities are about the problem. Look how terrible this problem is. Look how awful it is being a Syrian refugee. Look how awful it is being a homeless young person. Look how awful it is being this donkey. And I'm not saying it's great being a Syrian refugee child, but you're not giving because the problem is awful, or not giving just because the problem is awful. You're giving because you want something to get better. So what you are really interested in is finding an effective solution.
Okay.
And in my experience, the number of charities that talk about their solutions is quite a small proportion, and the number who talk about how effective their solution is even smaller still. So on the train on the way here, for example, I saw a very standard advert for a homelessness organisation. Look how dreadful it is being homeless, and this is how many homeless young people there are in London, I think. That is undoubtedly true, but that's a completely different question to, is this particular organisation effective at ameliorating that problem? And as a donor, as a smart donor, that's what you want.
Okay.
Is organisations that are effective at solving the problem they're trying to solve.
So how do you go about this then, as someone who, sort of average income, wants to give a proportion of that to a charitable cause, set up a direct debit to a cheque, whatever it is? What's the process to go through to decide how to give and who to give it to?
So let's take those two separately. So let's think first about who to give to. So what I would do is to think about the causes that you are most interested in And then the problem that you have is that there's a bazillion charities. So in the UK, there's 180,000 alone. There's 1 million in America. There's plenty more that are registered in Africa or Southeast Asia or wherever. So you have an embarrassment of riches in terms of the number to choose from. As I say, what I would always look for is organisations that talk not just about the problem, but about their solution, and furthermore, which have some compelling evidence about the effectiveness of their solution. Mm-hmm. So it's quite hard, actually, to find out which charities are really the most effective. There are a couple of tricks that you can use. One is to not look at the amount that they spend on administrative costs. That is often the things that donors turns to most.
Because people like to think that their money is going straight to the beneficiary, rather than being, I think people imagine admin as photocopying and...
I understand this, that people think of administration as waste and they want the waste to be minimised. And I understand wanting the waste to be minimised. But it turns out that administration is not waste. So with Kids Company, for example, you'll remember when that UK charity collapsed. And it turned out that, for example, they had spent hardly anything on governance, so their governance was very weak. And hence lots of the decisions were not very well made. And secondly, they had all their records of their children and young people they were helping were all in paper, in filing cabinets. So, of course, it was quite difficult to work out what was really going on. So, if you want to run an organisation well, then you have to have decent computers and decent offices, and you have to have management systems and governance systems, and you have to. I mean, nobody who does private equity thinks, oh, the way to save money with this company is to strip out the finance function. Or nobody who runs a hospital thinks the way to improve patient outcomes is to get rid of all the expensive equipment or whatever.
Because when we're talking about about admin. In terms of charities, it can be things like that, as you say with Kids Company, keeping records of things. But it's also things like protocol and systems. So if something goes wrong, a sort of whistleblowing system, which
and it can also be doing the research to figure out what works and what doesn't work, which is absolutely imperative. It can also be going to meetings with other organisations to find out what they are learning about how best to solve these jolly difficult social problems, or reading the academic literature about how best to solve them. So it's absolutely a false economy to strip out all of that. So a good trick is to ignore the administrative costs. It's a bit hard because often it's the only thing that is published and that is comparable between different organisations. So I really get mad when charities put stuff through my door that says, 75% or 75 pence in every pound or whatever gets spent on the actual cause and the rest goes on fundraising and governance. It's like, well, what are you spending money on which is not the actual cause? Yes. Everything should be directed to the actual cause. Otherwise you should call the police. So that's one thing. The other trick is that you can look at other organisations that are funding that particular charity that you're interested in. So there are many foundations, professional grant-making bodies who employ banks of people to find and analyse non-profits who they're going to fund themselves. So the Big Lottery Fund is an example, Comic Relief is an example, the Sainsbury Family Charitable Trusts just across the street from where we are right now is an example. And if you fund an organisation that they have funded, then the chances are you'll be fine. Okay. So I call this investing like Warren Buffett, in that you're leveraging the research that someone else has done. There are a couple of independent analysts in the non-profit world, not many. So I'm on the board of one called The Life You Can Save, which looks at non-profits doing international development work. And we recommend about a dozen charities which are particularly cost-effective, doing very important work and particularly cost-effective. And there's an organisation called Impact Matters, which is sort of related to us, but sort of not. And they have done independent analysis of, again, about a dozen charities. Some overlap, but some non-overlap. So you can use a reference, in effect, from other organisations that are funding that charity.
That seems to make sense when you describe how many people and what kind of processes it can take to really do that rigorous research. Then why do it yourself when when it would be that much of a burden on you as an individual.
Yeah, and I think a key thing to understand is that charities, I think really a key thing to understand is that charities vary enormously in how effective they are. They really vary in how effective they are. And I say this, and I feel like I can't say this often enough or loud enough, because it's quite counterintuitive that most people, if you're at a party or something and you meet somebody and they work for a charity, most people will go, oh, that's great. They won't then think, I wonder if it's really effective and how much good it really does. And in a way, I'm a scientist by background, and giving evidence, our organisation is about evidence, and the book that I wrote is all about how you can give effectively and looking at the evidence. And it's about trying to be a little scientific in understanding and a little sceptical in looking at how charities work and what they do. Not with the aim of poking holes, but with the aim of finding which organisations can most effectively turn our funds into social change.
Okay.
Some organisations are much better at that than others. And I am constantly astonished at the number of people who give to charity, even on a very large scale and of their own money, who don't seem that interested in whether these organisations are any good. And if you are giving £10 or £10 million to organisation A, and perhaps there is an organisation B down the road that does a better job, that means that there are some people, or dolphins, or trees, or whatever, that are missing out because you're funding, as it were, the wrong organisation. So there's an opportunity cost here.
Yes,
which
we
is
don't
very
necessarily
significant.
consider. I think often we'll think, well, it's good enough that I've given X amount of money to this cause, and you've seen the plight in adverts on the tube of people who are requiring your money. To give is enough. And you don't think about the opportunity cost of the other people who you might be able to help with the same funds, should you find a better charity. But I wonder, when you found a good one, then what? A check? A direct debit?
So I would, once you found one that you like and that you think is effective, I would try to stick with it. So to save yourself the work of chopping and changing. And I would also set up a direct debit, because that is, I think, the cheapest way for a charity to receive your money. I think if you do it through a credit card or cheque, there's often transaction fees for them. And with a direct bank transfer, there's usually no fee. And if you set it up as a direct debit, then you won't forget.
When you say stick with it, if a charity is good, does it need to continue receiving the same amount of funds?
Why did you say that?
Well, I think it's a question that people ask. Should they not see after 5 years that their charity has achieved X, Y, or Z? Is there still going to be that same need for their funds?
Well, social change takes a long time, and 5 years is not a long time. It depends what they are doing. So there are some types of services, this is actually quite a complicated question. There are some types of services that we will always need. Hospices, for example. There will always be people who need support at the end of their lives. That need is never going to go away, right? There are some needs which we would like to go away, but which don't seem to be going away. Things relating to war, violence, refugees. I mean, Syria appears to be a war about water, right, because of climate change. It hasn't rained in Syria for, I think, 7 years. And for the last 15 years, people have been saying that as water becomes more scarce, we can expect to see more fights over it. So, we would like this need to go away, but I don't see any need for it going away anytime soon. So one of the organisations very involved on the ground there is the International Rescue Committee, run now by former Foreign Secretary David Miliband. It's 150 years old, I think, because refugees, keep popping up in different places. And there are some organisations where some needs which we would hope that they go away quite rapidly, but I would say those are the exception, actually. Those are the exception.
I want to ask you, talk in your book about breadth versus certainty. So once you've identified a particular cause, there are all different sort of approaches that you can take to helping to fund it. Could you talk us through it a little?
Yeah, so this is a really important dimension of choice that charities make and that donors have to make. So let's take an example. Suppose that you want to help a disabled child. One thing that you could do is to provide some equipment to that disabled child. That would make a big difference to them relatively quickly. It would be very visible. It would be very attributable to you. It would be obvious that you did it. But on the flip side, it would do nothing at all for the disabled child over the street. In fact, it might be annoying for them, actually. So that's one way of intervening, is very direct with that beneficiary. Another way of intervening is that you might work with that child's school, let's say, to provide equipment for disabled children in that school, or to adapt it to be better for disabled children. You might train the teachers to be better at dealing with disabled children. So there, if you film the work that you're doing in your viewfinder, you may not actually have the child. You may have like builders and teachers and policymakers and stuff. And you're now one step removed from the child, but on the upside, you're having, if you're successful, influence over many more disabled children. But it's less obvious that it was you that did it, and it takes a bit longer, and it's less certain because there's more things that can go wrong in between. You could take a step further away still, and you could work with, let's say, all teacher training colleges in the country, so that all teachers are better at training children. Now, if you film the work, it looks like a room full of adults. And so again, so you are, another step further removed from the child, but the trade-off is that you are having influence over more children if you are successful. Or you might work with policymakers to, if you were doing this in the early 90s, you might have worked on the Disability Discrimination Act to ensure that all public buildings were accessible to people with mobility impairments. And so there, again, if you are successful, you have a benefit for a gazillion people, but the chances of you succeeding are lower. It's less attributable to you, it's less photogenic, it's less fast, but the impact is on many more people. So there's basically a trade-off there between proximity to the beneficiary versus the scale of the impact. And you see that in almost every area of social change, there is that trade-off. So you can see how it relates to teaching, how it relates to health. At this end you're doing stuff with patients, at this end you're doing stuff on policy and research, usually. My own work in trying to improve philanthropy as a whole is kind of a step further this way. So donors just vary, individuals just vary in where they want to be on that, how the kind of risk return, the certainty of impact and the scale of impact, where they're comfortable. And charities play in quite different places on that spectrum. One organisation that I'm very energised about is called All Trials, and it's about dealing with the problem that about half of all medical clinical trials never get published. Right? It's a total shambles. It's a shame. Shame on us as a race that we do this. And it means that gazillions of people, you and me, we receive medical treatments, drugs, surgical interventions, non-pharmacological interventions, which are essentially untested. Because it's like if you flip a coin and every time it comes up heads, you just discount that. And we're like, oh, look, magically, it looks like the thing is completely tough. It's like a sort of rigged trial. I mean, it's sort of astonishing that this goes on. And All Trials is a campaign to fix that, to get the results of all trials published. Okay, it is an intervention at this end. Yeah. Right. And the reason that I'm so energized about it is because the beneficiaries that it affects is literally every single person on the planet now and forever. Yeah. So we are all beneficiaries of this, and as it happens, this work is pretty effective and quite cheap. So people vary in their bias or where they are most comfortable. I happen to be a system person, so for me, it doesn't make much sense to be doing medical support for individual people, given that we have this epic systemic problem that half the data are missing.
Yeah. So you just have to, it doesn't sound like there's a right answer or a wrong answer, it's just working out on that kind of spectrum where you are and giving accordingly.
Yeah, and being clear about where you want to be, and also being clear about where the charity is. Some charities play at several points at once, that's pretty common.
Can I ask you finally, what if you don't want to give money? Are there other ways that you can, obviously volunteering, but are there other things that you can give or ways into volunteering?
Yeah, there's loads that you can do. So there is, there are all kinds of non-financial things that you can give. You can give your old car, you can give your, when you're getting rid of, taking your clothes and books and stuff to the charity shop, or when you're selling your furniture, we recently moved house, got rid of some furniture, that all went to a charity shop, for example. If you have long hair and you're having it cut off, a friend of mine just did this, donated her hair so that it gets made into wigs, for example. And then, in the age of social media, there's masses that many of us can do as activists that doesn't require financial exchange. So talking to your mates or talking on social media and, being active in that way can be very powerful. Yeah.
Caroline, thank you so much for talking us through giving.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us for the Big Money Questions.